Welcome to the Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm Beth Bailey, and today I'm excited to bring on our guest, Gareth Westwood, who was working as a security analyst in Kabul between 2019 and January of 2021. Gareth was based out of a diplomatic mission, but he's asked that we don't identify where exactly he worked today. For listeners who are hoping that today's conversation might delve into classified topics, I'm going to disappoint you immediately. Everything that Gareth and I talk about is going to be completely unclassified, but I can guarantee you that his perspective is going to enrich your understanding of the disastrous errors and other things that were taking place in the lead up to the withdrawal in August of 2021. For a bit of background on Gareth, he was working in education before joining the British military, and after a period in which he deployed a number of times to the Middle East, Gareth left the military and embarked on a 4-year career contracting as a security analyst, where during that time he got to live and work in Pakistan and Afghanistan, and I'm super jealous of that. Since 2021, Gareth has worked in the private sector, first as a senior manager for intelligence at a pharmaceutical company, and now as head of global intelligence at the risk consulting firm Sibylline, where he leads a team of 30 analysts delivering a broad portfolio of advisory products to an array of cross-sector clients. Gareth, it's so great to have you on today to talk about your insights on the pre-withdrawal period and the impact that it had on you and many of your friends and colleagues.
Beth, it's great to be here, and hello to all of your viewers and listeners.
Awesome. Well, let's kick it off with, you arrive in Kabul in 2019, and I want to know, what were your thoughts and prospects at that time on Afghanistan's future? And specifically, did you think that the government of Afghanistan would have its shot at overcoming the Taliban if NATO countries withdrew their forces, or was that even a real topic of conversation in 2019?
Yeah, so I arrived after a period in Pakistan, and I frankly didn't know what to expect. My remit was very much the tactical sphere, looking at threats, analysing threats to the mission, people, assets, and operations. However, it became quite clear quite quickly that the strategic aspects of the conflict, most notably, the efforts to get the Afghan forces to stand on their own 2 feet, and the government as well, those are intrinsic to the tactical environment. There had been some pretty significant high-profile attacks prior to going on post whilst I was in Pakistan. So, for example, the German embassy bomb, a significant event. So the chinks were there. That the Haqqani network, as it turned out to be, could get that close to the green zone in Kabul. It made one consider, okay, well, what's the situation like in the provinces, in the districts, if several ton truck bomb can be exploded within vicinity of what is the corridors of power in Kabul, in the green zone, and the diplomatic compound. But at that time, I think when I arrived, a bit naive, and I shouldn't have been. I'd been in South Asia for over 2 years at that time, but a bit naive. I assumed it was largely under control, I guess, and that the training environment and the mission, since the cessation of combat missions and the capacity building, I assumed it was kind of on track. Although when I got to my first briefing, it was pretty obvious that the foundations of this capacity building project, in Britain, it went from Operation Herrick to Operation Toll. That effort, maybe the foundations were on shaky ground. As we went through 2019, it became pretty clear that it was definitely shaky, if not in some places completely collapsing.
Wow. And do you think that that's the difference between maybe what we saw in the media and what people wanted us to see in the media, and then what was really happening on the ground? Or do you think that maybe it was just a perception, like an individual perception?
Listen, you saw some of the documentaries, we had a chap who used to be in a soap opera called EastEnders, called Ross Kemp, and he was He was a known entity in Afghanistan in terms of his documentary making. He did he's done subsequent documentaries on all sorts, but even in those kind of documentaries, when I think we were still in the pre-2014, definitely pre-2010 stage, I think, you did get kind of anecdotes of coalition soldiers getting frustrated with Afghan colleagues. Some Afghan forces maybe not standing up to the extent they could do. We had the Sandhurst in the sand, obviously in the northwest of central Kabul, which ostensibly was functioning absolutely fine. But if you scratch away under the surface, it was, as I said, pretty clear to anybody who looked. One didn't have to have privileged access to see this, that even in the major population centers, this effort was not all that it seemed. The exceptions, of course, were the elite units, the crisis response units, Crew 222, Crew 333, Afghan Special Forces. Those were trained by your countrymen and mine, and really did stand up, I feel. And again, there were many great Afghan commanders in the ANP and the ANA and the other forces as well around the provinces. But I think it's all you had to do is scratch away at the surface, especially in the rural areas, where the structural aspects of what was being trying to achieve, what was being attempted to be achieved, weren't getting the full buy-in, let's say, of the local villagers who observed a tribal way of life, rather than what we were trying to impose. But yeah, I think the media, not consciously, but I mean, by that time, Afghanistan was kind of old news, right? By then we'd already had, the annexation of Crimea. My side of the pond, preoccupied with our votes to leave the European Union. You had, the election of Donald Trump, rather unexpected. There's lots of now, quite distracting influences, I think, globally that meant that I just think Afghanistan wasn't the news that it should have been at the time. So I don't think it's necessarily negligence on anybody's part that this didn't get covered to the fullest extent, and ergo not quite understood.
Sure, yeah, we see it continuing today. We had that small period when Afghanistan was really covered, and now we're back to the same kind of thing. During that first year specifically, because obviously 2020 brought about some really crazy changes that you got to live through, but that first year in 2019, what were frustrating developments that you witnessed around you?
Okay, so I think the frustration didn't come until we got nearer the peace deal. However, there were frustrating periods. I mean, I think frustrating is the wrong word. We had a record number of high-profile attacks in 2019. So we were regularly running for cover, donning body armor, and diving into kind of shelters, etc., which in itself is frustrating when one is trying to enjoy an embassy party. I jest. However, it was a febrile year. 2019, we saw a campaign from, some say, the Haqqani network, some say the Taliban. Is there a difference? There is, but it's nuanced. So the group Taliban, right, and Haqqani enablers, a campaign that started in May, actually, to what they thought would be augment and underline the peace protest with high-profile attacks. So you could almost, put a bet that, put a wager that a seminal moment in the peace talks, a meeting in Doha, would be underlined with a high-profile attack in Kabul. I think the first one in May was CARE International. It was an NGO based in Kabul, linked to, I think, USAID. I think that was the link and the tenuous reason. And it carried on, including high-profile attacks targeting, Afghan security force compounds, the government. I think there was well over 20. Depending how you class a high-profile attack. Of course, NATO classified a high-profile attack differently than we did. But nevertheless, it was a febrile time, underscored with regular kind of rocket attacks that changed in nature the year after, but we can talk about that. And each time the Taliban stroke Haqqani network struck, the peace deal talks seemed to carry on. So, I wouldn't be surprised if in their mind this was working. Although what was really happening is that nobody was watching because they were too busy getting peace sorted to notice the highest number of high-profile attacks, including the probable use of very sophisticated kind of EFP, DFC, some kind of projectile attack on a US convoy. It's never really been officially ascertained the nature of the attack, which was up near Bagram. But my point being, there were some absolutely deadly attacks that targeted Afghans and Western officials, Western coalition soldiers, sailors, airmen. But as I said, it wasn't being noticed because, well, we were too busy having peace. That was until somebody did notice that the US president, on the 5th of September, there was an attack which targeted a US vehicle on the northern gate rather, of an NDS compound near an avowed, open NDS compound in the green zone. It was a couple of kilometers away from our location. One of our diplomats was actually in the vicinity of it when it went off and saw it in front of them, had to turn back immediately. That killed, I believe, a Romanian official, and what was reported in the media as a US soldier, I think it was reported in some newspapers as a US Special Forces soldier. And despite the 25 high-profile attacks, as we defined them previous in that year, which started with an unprovoked attack on an NGO in May. Despite that, in September 5th, somebody in the States noticed, and the peace deal, and it's well documented now, was paused. Now, at this point, I can only imagine the pious Taliban leadership, the ideologues, your bereders, realizing what was going down in Kabul with the operational guys in the Taliban, the Haqqani network, etc. I can only imagine them going, what on earth are you doing? We was getting so far, and we was enjoying some wonderful food in Qatar, and it was going great, and we had peace, apart from your record number of high-profile attacks in Kabul, not to mention what was going down everywhere else, and there was a lot going down everywhere else, but we are focused mainly on Kabul. So that's when the peace deal kind of paused. I think it was 5th of September. We had, after that, one or two isolated attacks, but it wasn't really clear who was doing it. Maybe both Taliban, maybe ISIS, maybe criminals, who knows. But that's kind of what ended it, really. Trump said, off you go, no peace deal. And therein, the talks, I guess, started in earnest after a period of time, and that's the period that led to the February the following year, which is obviously that when the official peace deal was signed. So that was 2019. It was a quite explosive year, literally, and a great introduction to Afghanistan. I mean, I'm flippant, but a lot of people got injured and lost their lives. So that's not good. But that was my first year, and then of course we got to December 2019, and well, people started getting a cough, and it all changed. But I guess we'll get onto that.
Yeah, I guess it makes more sense to go with COVID. I was going to ask you about Doha, but COVID came next, and so now here you are in Kabul with this global pandemic coming your way. What did that do to your work?
Well, there was a bit of optimism, I think, to start off with. If you remember those first 3 months, it was like, this is going to go away. I was on a rotation where I did about 2 months in country, and then I'd come back to the UK for 2 weeks at a time. That was kind of my rotation. It might have been more like 6-7 weeks actually. Anyway, yeah, COVID was interesting, and in the grand scheme of things, it was both the most impactful and least impactful of the period, right? So um, it was most impactful in terms of just your day to day, because immediately, upon realizing it was a thing, I think February, March, that time, we had to go down to very few staff. So there was more of us in the security analysis cell at the beginning of that period. We were down to like one person. We had to work long hours, etc. And all the distancing, etc. Although, of course, in Afghanistan, nobody had COVID. Um, I say, or if they did, there's only very few. I can't remember the numbers, but the numbers were laughably low. But of course, in Afghanistan at the time, and listeners, please correct me if you've got many Afghan friends and colleagues. I know, Beth, so please correct me if I'm wrong here. Um, but I seem to remember that there was some proclamation. I don't know if it was in Kabul or nationwide that one couldn't have a Muslim funeral if one died of COVID. However, if one died of something else, you could have that full funeral. So just everyone was dying of other things. Um, just absolutely not COVID. Just so yeah, and the Afghans cracked on. It seemed, I'm sure many took it seriously, and I'm sure many had tragic stories to tell. But it seemed that we're in Afghanistan. We're in a war-torn country. We've been at war for decades. We have an increasing insurgent problem. We can't go around the corner without somebody attaching a magnetic IED to a police car. We have poverty, malnourishment, famine, God knows how many other diseases. Bit of COVID, bring it on. We'll crack on because we frankly cannot afford not to go to work. And you have this juxtaposed with this, what must have looked like a completely alien regime in the green zone where most of the embassies were, whereby Western diplomats were, observing their distances and doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And I'm positive there were no diplomatic parties at that time as well, on the record.
That must have been odd in and of itself. I mean, I always bring this up because I can't believe it. In Operation Pineapple Express, which is, I don't know if you've read that book by, yeah. So he talks about how there was a sip and paint a sip and paint planned at the embassy, the American embassy, for the day that the Taliban took over the country. And they only canceled it, right before, because God forbid that they cancel this painting and drinking event for the embassy. It cracks me up. It must be a different world to work in a place like that.
I can imagine, but yeah, embassy parties, etc. I think we can put that into the realm of classified information that I'll not go into.
Fair enough. I can allow that to slide. So in the middle of, or I guess right as this pandemic is sweeping its way towards Afghanistan, but not really Afghans, and the rest of the world, the Doha Agreement comes forward. And, I don't think there were many people who supported that agreement, or Zalmay Khalilzad, who negotiated it on former President Donald Trump's behalf. But, what were your thoughts when you first saw the news of the Doha Agreement?
Well, we managed to print it out pretty much in its entirety straight away. And it was immediately obvious that the Afghan government weren't really, well, it was obvious to me anyway, that the Afghan government weren't really involved here. And it was more diktat, direction from Doha that this is what's going to be observed. I was immediately skeptical. There's plenty of provisions in the peace agreement that is now, I believe, open source, but things such as an agreement on counterterrorism, agreements on attacks, nationwide attacks. I'm like, well, how can anybody in the Taliban parade, even the Quetta Shura, how can they control what goes on in Kunar, or Wardak, or Herat, or in the north, or how can how can Bereda control what's going to go down with a pretty much autonomous former criminal network, the Akani network? How are they going to do that? how are they going to exercise operational discipline? I said, but I hope they do. I hope they do. But insofar as I had been looking carefully at the Taliban and all the actors, from Hig to Haqqani in some depth by now, I wasn't confident that this is something that Taliban could follow through on in the fullest extent. So that begged the question, how would it end? And my initial thoughts were, well, they're not going to be able to keep their side of the bargain for long. As it turned out, they couldn't, and it didn't matter.
Isn't that the frustrating thing? And like you mentioned, the Afghan government were not included, and there were so many points where they were supposed to be, there were supposed to be negotiations down the line with the Afghan government, from my understanding, but they never came to any kind of conclusion, but they weren't involved in the first place. And here you have, that's always been a strategic error in my mind, because the Taliban's whole argument was, hey, Gyroa is a puppet government. That's the U.S. put them there and is controlling the strings. And then the U.S. goes and leaves that government that they did help to stand up out of the negotiations. Doha had so many flaws and faults, and the fact that we continued to refer to it as we push towards this end, because so many people were sick they were sick of being in Afghanistan. They were sick of 20 years had passed and the progress was not happening. Anyway, I digress. What were your thoughts on just the Afghan government portion too, them being not included?
Okay, so I think you raised a few good points there from the outset. If we were naive in not talking to the bad guys, quote unquote, in the early years, especially at Oslo, we were doubly naive in not talking to the government that we helped construct, I guess, or the infrastructure that we helped construct in Afghanistan. Now, I know they democratic elections, etc., but it seemed to be cutting off our nose to spite our face. And the cynic would say it was a piece of paper written so we would get out. And the more cynical amongst my colleagues would say, well, if, I don't know, a US president can say, I got you out of Afghanistan, that is an excellent line for a campaign. And as you say, folks are getting Afghan tired. People just let it make it end, spending too much money on it. It was being used as a political football. I wonder where we're seeing that these days. From the Afghan side, I still had faith that the Afghan government could wait out, hold the fort, especially in Kabul. It's a realistic possibility that they could have done. We saw the US numbers dwindling and dwindling and dwindling, and it got to a critical mass below which the government and the forces couldn't stand on their own 2 feet. However, there were some serious errors up to this point. There was a denial that the Taliban did not have control of their own troops. And it was obvious that they didn't nationwide, because the attacks were going up. You could see it in the open sources. You could see it, if you had any bit of social media scraping kits, which you can buy off the shelf, and many companies have that. It was obvious that attacks were going up. And it's actually obvious that the Taliban were playing a very cute game with Gyroa forces, ANDSF. You could see them surrounding the population centres. Beth, what they would do, and this is well documented, they would go in, harass the local checkpoint, ANA checkpoint, ANP maybe, to the extent to completely deplete their morale, their resources, their will to fight. And these folks maybe hadn't been paid for quite a while, because there was endemic corruption in some parts of, the whole piece, the whole government piece. That's obvious. That's no surprise. And they'd get harassed, and eventually they'd get offered a better life just to put your arms down. Defect to the Taliban if you want, but just put your arms down. And many of them, with one magazine between three or four of them, getting harassed on a nightly basis, welcome the opportunity to go home to their family, maybe get paid, maybe have some food and water. And you saw that around the villages, around each major population centre. You also saw then following that in some villages, letter campaigns, propaganda campaigns from the Taliban installing their way of governing. And there you go. That village would fall. That village would then become de facto controlled by the local Taliban faction. And you can see it around each population centre. We saw it in Kabul, Pakman, over to the west. We saw it over to the east as well, on the road out to Nangarhar, the Jalalabad road. We saw it in the south, definitely in the north. As you go more to, we saw it everywhere. And what they were doing, it was quite obvious. They were positioning themselves to ingress into the population centres should the time arise. Now, that's not classified because that's quite literally what happened at pace. It was interesting that they tried it, I think, in the autumn of 2020, and they got their wrists slapped by the US, who was still there at the time. So, yeah, they tried to go to Kandahar. No, thank you. No, you don't. Off you go. And they bided their time, because as they've always said from the off, the Taliban has the time. We've got the watches. They've got the time.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed they did. So when, I was watching the collapse from afar back in the UK the next year, it wasn't surprising to see these falling. I think, the key thing for me is when Herat fell. That was, anyway, by the by, I fast forward a little bit. So there was initially hope, but there was always hope that ANDSF have this, but there were such crucial errors, replacing, for example, ANA guards on the city gates of Kabul with ANP. ANA were often out of town. They weren't from Kabul in many cases, and they couldn't be relied on to be pressured. They couldn't be pressured, by blackmail or coercion. We know where you live, etc. They could be pressured. So, listen, it wasn't impermeable. Folks still got stuff in, through the south on the Development Road. They got stuff in through Jalalabad, through the north, especially as well. But it was, you could trust the ANA to a certain extent. You could trust the ANP, but unfortunately, the ANP were local. So, you have a well-meaning ANP officer, but they were far, far more susceptible to coercion, violent coercion, threats to their family, etc., than some ANA officer who's from out of town, maybe from up north. So at that point, we started to see the city gates getting more porous, and was that a strategic point in the peace deal? Probably not. No, but it was something to add to the cluster. And then, as I said, you had this mass defection. You also had a campaign, quite a acute campaign, from the Taliban of assassinating key figures within population centres. Like, all of a sudden, the high-profile attacks stopped to a certain extent, and you'd all of a sudden be reporting 5, 6, 7 magnetic IED attacks against police vehicles, or a judge's vehicle, or an academic's vehicle each week, and high-profile assassinations with using small arms fire, stuff that looked to be criminal, but there was a pattern of behaviour. And this was very simple. This was kind of the other part of their shaping campaign. They would surround the population centres, then potentially remove blockers within the population centres, shaping the ground for what was to come. But there was just complete inertia. The direction was to withdraw, and that was it. So all we could really do is watch this happen, try to report it up the chain, and see how it turned out, I guess.
And I can only imagine how frustrating that was. We've had We actually have had 2 episodes with Bill Raggio from Long Wars Journal, who's been following the Taliban. He's one of the people I started following when I started reading about Afghanistan, in 2008-9 time period. And he was talking about the map that he made, which you probably saw as the country was falling, of all these provinces and districts and the real control, because NATO was saying one thing. He had a different analysis. And as we watched, the withdrawal continue, he was correct. And it just reminds me, he's not the only one who's come on the podcast and talked about how information was manipulated or framed to kind of make the ANA appear to be more ready to fight the Taliban than they really were. We had, oh my goodness, Colonel Parwani from the ANDSF, he was an ANASOC colonel. Anyway, he was talking about how ill supplied his forces were, and nobody really wanted to talk about that. But basically, the point is, we were not giving the ANA what they needed to continue that fight anyway. And as you have the Taliban coming in and making these overtures or killing your people, there's not really. I guess my question with this whole long diatribe is, did you see any instances of that, or any, kind of, oh, well, look, the ANA is the problem here. Let's frame this so that the ANA looks like the problem so that we can get out clean, as you were watching that last year play out?
I mean, it shouldn't have come as a surprise that the ANA was not able to stand on their own 2 feet. However, there was an understanding that there was a critical mass of coalition NATO troops, support, CT personnel, whatever, that would work. And I think there was, I think, don't quote me on the number, but, there's at one point there's about 2,500 personnel with a tail of contractors, including, a few hundred Brits in the Kabul Security Force, others as well. I thought that seemed at the time like enough. Considering there's 25,000 US personnel in South Korea, again, don't quote me on the number, it seemed like a realistic, enduring number. And that would, in my opinion, have been enough with the air assets to keep the population centres, the main population centres, under some kind of heroic control. One can only imagine that, the desire for a complete withdrawal was of rhetorical value rather than strategic value. A complete withdrawal, and to that end, I think it was more of a political choice, but I can't be certain. Did I see any evidence of covering stuff up? Right. The first thing I'll say is that I think everyone that I worked with, from whether it be Westerners or other partners, acted in good faith, and I have the utmost respect for what they did. Notably, after my time, the effort to evacuate was admirable. Some folks putting their lives on the line to do what needed to be done. My own ambassador, Laurie Bristow, staying behind in those famous images on UK news, and all the staff there. And I recognise many of the staff there when I turned on the TV, and they did an amazing job. And I have no doubt that people were trying to blow the whistle on this. Absolutely no doubt. What I can say is that there seemed to be a push for optimism, with maybe more pessimistic reporting looked upon more dimly. There's any mission, there's a host of documents that get pushed up, down, and sideways. Emails, diplomatic telegrams, other documents, etc. And I think, being kind, the desire to only see the good news meant that less optimistic reporting may have been overlooked. Willfully, unwillfully, I'm not going to really comment, because I don't know. I'm not in the minds of the people, on the very top floors. But what yeah, what I will say is that there were enough people who knew that this was the least worst yet most likely outcome, a Taliban takeover of the country. And even from the off, there was folks, I guess, folks in my office that were looking at this. So what it does beg the question, why it continued the way it did. As I said, I can only imagine it's political. Folks who come into my office and say, Gareth, what's going to happen? And I said, well, just read Ghost Wars and just read it fast and compress the timeline. Because whilst it wasn't a carbon copy, one could have guessed from that. But as I said, I think there was some blind optimism, and I don't really know why. Certainly in the first year of the peace deal, I remember, apparently there was a part of the peace deal that nobody else could see, apparently. Everyone was talking about it, what's the secret bit of the peace deal? Might have been just rumor or conjecture invented by somebody, but everyone thought, I remember everyone was thinking, right, the US aren't going to completely pull out. They can't completely pull out. And there was talk about, right, okay, will there be a small presence of advisors to help this and that, But no, to be fair, General Miller, every time he'd come on the weekly call, we are pulling out, and not sure people could quite believe it until Bagram happened. But I fast forwarded every which way there. There's plenty of things to discuss in the run up to that. So apologies, got a tendency to babble. And it's in the UK. It's the end of our day here in the UK. So a little bit weary, but please, yeah, crack on.
Yeah. Well, my next question, it kind of follows from this because you had the perspective. I'm watching the American news, right, and you could tell, we were driving that peace talk train. The U.S. was, and I just wondered, what was the perspective of British leaders in the months leading up to 2021 and the withdrawal? Were they in agreement with those U.S. efforts, or do you think that they might have chosen a different path forward if they had been given more of a say in that?
Okay, so I was very much at the ground level, so I didn't have close access to leadership. Although I will. I will say that there was definitely an optimism that both, if the US wouldn't completely 100% pull out, although they told us this quite a few times, but there's also optimism that a solution would be found, and there's optimism that ANDSF would hold out at least in Kabul. I don't think much more could have been done to spell out what was going on from the ground level. I worked with some tremendous colleagues, and all of them acted in great good faith and reported on what they could see happening at the time. I guess perspectives and recollections differ depending on how you're working. I mean, if your job is to look at these attacks, and look at the security situation primarily, exclusively, and critically, then one's perspective is going to be a bit different to somebody who's rising up, the civil service fast stream, or in the State Department. And also, I had maybe the advantage of being a contractor. You mentioned at the very beginning, Beth, I was contracted. I wasn't actually a civil servant in any government. I was, whilst I had all the accesses, etc., and I lived on what is a diplomatic mission compound, I was quasi-independent in that I wasn't seeking a career in my host government's Department of State or whatever the case may be. So, and I've always been one for having a pessimistic overview. I don't know whether it's because of the results of the kind of work I've been involved in, how one is trained, as a security intelligence professional, or whether it's because, my roots in rather rainy Wales, which is where I originally hail from, and we're all quite pessimistic there. Because it's a hard life growing up in South Wales. So I don't know whether I'm a natural pessimist, but I certainly found favour with many of my colleagues who were reporting this. And I think leadership were aware. In truth, it was the US's show from the outset. We were helping in any way we can, or we could. So one can therefore see why, even with the best will in the world, not many other countries could do much. Just help and support our US colleagues, share information back to our host nations, and hope that we could find a solution. But at the same time, I mean, I still find it hard to believe that that optimism survived over a year, after I left. And there was still an unwillingness from some to look at the facts, possibly because they were involved in higher level discussions than I ever would be, and maybe there was a genuine reason to be optimistic after speaking to Giroa, and other international colleagues. I don't wish to seek malice where there is none, but I think optimism and naivety played a huge part, unfortunately. And we just didn't learn our lessons from, Iraq, for one, I think.
Sure. So it was your choice, from my understanding, to leave Afghanistan at the end of 2020, and I wondered what played into that decision.
I mean, it was a purely practical decision, I think. I'd spent 4 years overseas, coming back, 2 weeks at a time. And before that, I did my time in the military, and I deployed several times to the Middle East. And I quite fancied a normal life for a while. Walking the dog and making breakfast and all that kind of normal stuff. And whilst, COVID was still definitely a thing back at home, restrictions are starting to ease a little bit. There was a bit of normality back at home. So I decided to come home. Of course, hugely regretting it 8 months later, when the country and the city that I loved and I worked and lived in for 2 years collapsed under its own weight. I decided on purely practical grounds, and I probably made the right decision. Although, if I had my time again, I'd give anything to be able to be on the ground with my colleagues, to help with what must have been a horrendous process in the August.
Sure. What was it like to watch that play out? I can say for myself, I've talked about it on the podcast before, but when I left the intelligence world in 2013, I had to stop looking at Afghanistan because it was going to make me lose my mind. I got so just viscerally angry the first time I saw the Taliban raise their flag at their office in Qatar and pretend like they were some government in exile. And there was nothing I could do about it. I couldn't do a darn thing about it from here. And so I had to distance myself. And I just wrote about past experiences in Afghanistan or relating to Afghanistan. So for you, having actually been there and been so involved in those day-to-day things that were going on, I can't even imagine what it was like to watch the withdrawal play out, the Taliban close in, all of these things that you had been watching occur without being there. So what was that experience like for you?
Okay, so shooting from the hip slightly, I think four distinct phases of mindset. The first was, I was a security analyst, and we'd been predicting some of this stuff. And I was looking at Long War Journal, but I also had other accesses. And one of my best friends out there was actually, he'd gone from being an analyst in another diplomatic mission to one of the close protection personnel at the mission I worked at, and good friend, still very good friend now. and I remember speaking to him fairly regularly. But initially, I was looking at these, these districts falling, how they were falling, almost in the order that we'd, predicted. I mean, I say that now. Were they in the order? I'd like to think so. Maybe not. Let's just say they were. Uh, but the order of them falling in the manner in which we predicted, and me going, oh my god, like Herat, I didn't have that down for another 3 months. So the professional curiosity, I don't want to use the word excitement, but if you've been predicting something, talking about it, looking at it for years, and then you can see it happening, almost jealousy that you're not there, looking at it happening, looking at the feeds that you had, so professional excitement, that's the wrong word, but you'll, in lieu of a better word, I'll say that certainly absolute intrigue, and I was on the phone to my friends and colleagues all the time. Then fear. It fell, can't remember the exact date, but I was actually on a call. It was kind of late afternoon for me, later at night for my colleague. I was on the phone to the colleague that I just mentioned, and he said something like, Gareth, they're at Citygate 8, something like that, or they're on the development. They're here. And I hear this walkie-talkie going. Now, before that, I made sure that, he'd burnt any documents and anything that I had, any clothes that I'd accidentally left there, 8 months earlier in my accommodation block, so we was kind of, it wasn't a complete shock because we was talking all the time about the fall of Herat and what was happening in the north. Mazar Sharif, I was, Kunduz, each one surprised me more each time. But yeah, he said, Gareth, to William, I've got to go. Then it didn't hear off him for 48 hours, and it was abject fear. It turned out that I think he was one of the guys that closed the embassy and they hot-tailed it up to H. Kaya, and the rest is kind of history, really. Fear. And then very shortly after, I couldn't stay away from it. I had to take some days off work, and that's when the profound regret, sadness, anger started. And it was, it'd go from I'd call it strategic to tactical levels of emotional response each time. At the strategic level, I'd be having the same conversation that we've had with, amongst ourselves now, over my head, probably with quite a few more cuss words. And then at the tactical level, I'd be thinking of, all those Afghan staff that I'd work with closely. And we're not just talking about kind of interpreters or political officers or folks that were doing the aid stuff, but corporate services, to the folks that, serving us our pizzas in the bar. Sounds frivolous. But I'd had no doubt that Taliban would not care whether he was a first secretary political officer, an informant, an interpreter, or some guy that cleaned out the shipping containers that were our homes. And we'd rely so heavily on them. Not because we were lazy MC staff and we wanted our clothes folded and all our pods cleaned. No, but we relied so heavily on them for insight, for the guarding. We had Gurkha guards. I was petrified. I was absolutely petrified that they wouldn't get out, because they'd be seen as collaborators. And then all those individuals I did work with, inside the Chancery building, and inside the and then a sense of what was it for? What the hell was all that for? I've got, colleagues and friends that went there in the military, that either have seen some things that are affected right now, or maybe they've lost people, maybe they've lost friends. I've lost friends myself. So that whole 20-year period being an absolute waste, which it wasn't, of course, because 3 million Afghan women are now educated. Afghan civil society has had a taste of democracy and freedom. But we took it off the Taliban in 2001 and gave it back to them in 2021. So that were absolutely crushing. So the combination of those more strategic reflections, along with the devastation that folks I'd worked and lived so closely with we're now in the crosshairs of some pretty nasty people. Um, it had a devastating effect, and yeah, I'm sure it did for others as well. Those who'd in the military who'd done several tours and lost very close friends, who saw them die at the hands of the Taliban. So that was phase 3, and then phase 4. It's a bit more introspective. No, actually, it's a bit more conciliatory. When you think, was it ever going to work? And reasonable commentators, I'm not talking about kind of stop the war coalition folk who are ideologically against interventionism, and that's fine. I respect their right to have that opinion. But, reasonable commentators that would point out the flaws in this strategy all the way through, very early on, that, especially when I was in the military, folks like me would probably dismiss as pacifists or something like that. And are we ever going to be able to sustain what we had there? I mean, the answer is we could, with a critical mass of troops and contractors. But was that worth it? Maybe for those 3 million girls that went to school there, yeah. What's the what's the point? What are we trying to achieve? The Taliban isn't a global threat. It's not even a proscribed terrorist group, I don't think. Haqqani network, I believe, is. And obviously you got your Taliban Pakistan, who are now wreaking havoc in Pakistan, aided by the patronage of the Afghan Taliban just over the border. Apologies, I need to turn my Teams off. Sorry about that. So I'm sure you have that feeling as well. When you take yourself away from the project we didn't finish and the individuals who are now in danger that we once knew and we feel responsible for, you start to question why, and then you start to question the whole interventionist piece. But of course, if one sits back, one couldn't have sat back in 2001, and you start to think, was the mission creep inevitable? Many will paint a picture of opportunistic defense contractors and NGOs and aid folks that went far beyond their brief. But was there ever really anything we could have done? I guess we could have learned the lesson of Iraq when we pivoted towards that. But ultimately, you have a country that's sliced up in a way that establishing an Afghan national identity is, I guess, folly. When you have so many, you have a group of people, the Pashtuns, who many don't recognize the border. It was drawn by a guy, and nobody really cares about it, who live there anyway. So I guess those are the 4 phases, and I'm still in that 4th phase now. I'm now an associate director at a geopolitical risk consulting firm, and these kind of questions I kind of battle with now. Now I've been away from the whole piece for a while, but I think that 4th question there is a difficult one to answer. But yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, curiosity, fear, sorrow, and then introspection. Those I guess many colleagues as well would have felt the same to a greater or lesser extent.
Sure. And I know that you did talk to some colleagues about their perspectives on this too, because it's gutting. That's why this podcast exists, is because it has gutted this withdrawal and the pre-withdrawal period. It has gutted so many people who devoted themselves to Afghanistan, to Afghan people, to the people that helped them in their job, that they did the same thing. I've had many people describe to me what you just described about what's going to happen to the people who did those tasks for me, that now they worked in an environment that puts them at risk, and the Taliban do not care what you did to support, NATO and JIROA. They just care that you did it. So, it's a universal feeling among anyone who was there. And over 20 years with all these NATO partners, it's a lot of people. So did you want to share any of those insights that your friends had that they were not able to come on and share themselves?
I think I've tried to cover it off during our answers, but I do know folks that have now left government work slightly disgusted that there's been no outcry um, from public officials. I mean, there are several public officials that did absolutely the right thing. Many did absolutely the right thing. And as I said, I cannot praise the folks on the ground there, especially during that last year when it was, ground rush, I think. They did such a fantastic job. I talked about Laurie Bristow, but his team, absolutely wonderful. But, many of my colleagues are quite scathing about the blinkerness and what they see as incompetence. I'm somewhat alarmed that there hasn't been more accountability. Whilst what happened during the pandemic, and I know there's been lots of talk about rule breaking, all that kind of stuff in our country, lots of domestic political upheaval as a result of what happened during the pandemic. I've not seen a hundredth of a percent of effort go into looking at this and it matters, even if you don't really care that folks that we took on in good faith are now being targeted. Forget that. We need to learn the lesson from this, and the lesson is don't intervene. That's the wrong lesson. That is the wrong lesson. The lesson is how do you do it. And I thought we would have learned something from how we got Iraq kind of wrong. Was it, I mean, this is a different podcast, but you're deposing a dictator that gassed his own people. Not a bad thing, but you need a plan B. And in these dictatorships, they were only ever they aren't going to be a legitimate opposition with which to challenge, a cohesive opposition, whether that be a country run by the Taliban or a country run by Saddam Hussein. The legitimate cohesive opposition to their rule, well, they're dead or they're in jail, So one needs to think really carefully about what is the exit plan. What is the exit plan? Was the plan just to have 2,500 people there all the time, or 10,000 people there all the time? But we need to learn from it. We need to learn about interventionism. We also need to learn. I don't know what the lesson is in terms of folks having misguided optimism, but I think there needs to be a drastic lesson learned on how we conduct these things in future. But as we're saying this now, it's a slightly different scenario. But we have the potential in a year's time, as we're recording this, for the rug to be pulled out of from Ukraine, right? So we need to really, I think we need to think carefully about why we're doing these things. And then that's when you come to a very difficult conclusion that we invaded Afghanistan essentially to forever restrict the possibility of a global terrorist threat emanating from its borders. And one has to reluctantly admit that we've done that. Islamic State don't pose a threat globally in Afghanistan. Notwithstanding some of the horrendous rocket attacks they managed to somehow conjure up after the peace deal. Don't ask me how, but they did. Notwithstanding some of the horrific attacks on maternity wards and other soft targets, they don't pose a credible terrorist threat, that branch, outside the region, if not the borders, although their franchises in the Indian subcontinent, maybe there's a regional threat there. The Taliban, they pose a regional threat only insofar as they're giving TTP sanctuary, and therefore TTP are able to, the Pakistani Taliban, Tariq-e-Taliban Pakistan, they are able to unleash a broader campaign of terror on the Pakistani state than hitherto they'd been able to since before 2000, well, since their inception, actually. Although there's lots of machinations around TTP, including better leadership, etc. So it's not quite simple. AQIS don't really pose a threat. AQ in Afghanistan, yeah, I have no doubt the Taliban, Haqqani elements of the regime have taken them on. We saw that with the killing of Zawahiri in Kabul, but we were able to prosecute that from afar. So I guess it is mission accomplished for Afghanistan. Mission's accomplished, and that's the painful thing. What we went in to do has been achieved, and what has been left is a wake of carnage and heartache. But one can't argue with political leadership when they proclaim that the original objectives have indeed been emphatically enforced and achieved. And that's a dichotomy, I think you call it.
Man, that would be so disappointing to me, just because what that would be such a misleading, I feel like, of the Afghan people, that, oh, you support us because we're trying to make your country stronger, when in reality all we cared about was getting rid of a global terror threat. Then why would we have put all that? God, I don't know. I understand I have always been pessimistic about this problem set, but that might meet
Beth,
my
Beth, I think, and I just throw these out there as provocative, deliberately provocative questions, because essentially that line was the line that was the premise with which we completely withdrew. Right.
Oh yeah, we couldn't, and we weren't going to change Afghanistan. That, I think, that change to that more nationalistic ideal or whatever, that has to come internally if it's going to come. We cannot enforce that on anyone. It's when you and I were talking before we started recording, you talked about you can rent Afghan loyalty. You cannot buy it. That has to be internal. That has to be something that comes from within the country. And I keep watching for signs that maybe there is an opposition force that can unify people, because the other option is the Taliban will continue to run that country. That's the other option. And I don't see it. I see so many people saying, I'm the big guy. I'm the big guy. And it's like, that's what has happened here. For how long,
I mean, when you see the young people of Kabul, that's where you have hope. You see some of the population centres, that's where you have civil society.
Yes.
On side, and that's where you have some semblance of hope. Unfortunately, civil society isn't a well-armed, well-drilled military machine with predator drones. So to that end, it's hard now to see how militarily the Taliban could be deposed, and the rationale behind doing so. I mean, as Biden said, he wasn't going to send his kids to war for women's rights, and my answer to that is fair enough. But why is that an obvious statement? Why should that be an obvious statement?
It's not.
The counter-interventionist argument is, well, why not intervene absolutely everywhere? Well, it would be great to make everywhere a flourishing democracy, but it would be great for everywhere to have, some semblance of civil rights, I think. And that's not being too soft or left-wing. That's not being colonialist to say that, it's a noble endeavor to want to have people treated fairly across the world. And I believe once we, I mean, for God's sake, I was only 20 when it happened. But once we deposed the Taliban, there was an opportunity there that some saw to make that nirvana a reality of, maybe this is one failed state that, sure, okay, maybe we failed it, the British failed it all those hundreds of years ago. Maybe who knows, right? But maybe we can make this very troubled state that's been in a war-torn state for a long time. Maybe we can, have a fairer society here, and I think that gained traction. Before you knew it, we were nation building, and then we weren't. So it's a tragic affair, Beth. Um, I don't know. I hope in some of my ramblings I've alluded to some insight that might be at least of entertainment value to your listeners. And as I said, everyone that I've served there with, and everyone that come after, including that we make swipes at leadership here, but the diplomatic leadership, especially at the very end, doing all the right things. And I wish ill of no one who worked in a very challenging environment at that time. But we just now need to try to learn the lessons yet again behind what was something that actually had strategic consequences. When you're talking about Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, this had strategic machinations and outcomes that affected geopolitics on a global level after this as well. And that is another lesson we need to take from this. But I believe the role of the US as the global police person is maybe another podcast entirely. So I shall leave it there.
Yeah, I think that would be a great follow-up sometime, because it's interesting, and we do have lots of lessons to learn about Afghanistan, and I fear that we will not, because we are just leaving it out of the conversation entirely. And with that in mind, I want to conclude. I'm really grateful that we actually have a couple letters from Afghans in our possession right now that we're going to read out at the end of podcasts. And I urge any Afghan who wants to tell their story to please send it to us. You can talk about anything before the withdrawal, during the withdrawal, after the withdrawal, whatever you want to talk about. We would love to share your voice with the world. And the great thing about that too is if you maybe don't have the best command of English right now, use Google Translate. It works wonders. Send it to our inbox, which is the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com. Today's story comes from a man who wanted us to call him by his last name, Sai. I hope I'm not completely butchering that. He is a special immigrant visa applicant, and in the last stages of that process, there was an issue with the supervisor who provided his letter of recommendation that caused all of the applications that individual had sent letters of recommendation for to be stopped wherever they were in the process and rejected. Now, Sai has reapplied with new letters of recommendation, but he's still waiting in a really insecure and tumultuous situation. So this is his story in his own words, and he wrote this very beautifully. Hello and greetings. Amidst the hardships that have rendered my name unspeakable, I go by the last name Sai. Born and raised in Kabul, my journey through education was a battle, far more arduous than these words can capture. In 2019, I found purpose as a translator for the United States Army Corps of Engineers, a time I held dear, proud to serve my country aided by the U.S. support. Shoulder to shoulder, I stood with USACE until the very end, enduring the unimaginable chaos as Afghanistan fell. The harrowing days at Kabul airport, facing the terror of the Taliban, even being trapped behind its gates, beaten, and hoping for a chance to escape. Life turned into a nightmare once the U.S. troops departed. Despite having applied for special immigrant visa, the horrors of Kabul grew relentless. Endless waiting, hoping for a lifeline out of this nightmare, yet it never came. 2 years passed in the throes of economic hardship and fear. A glimmer of hope emerged when an interview at the American Embassy in Islamabad was granted. In June 2023, amidst adversities, I journeyed to Pakistan with my family, cleared the interviews, and anticipated our visas. However, fate had other plans. At a critical juncture, my case was unjustly rejected due to a supervisor's undisclosed issue. The despair was suffocating. The thought of returning to Afghanistan or enduring the dire conditions of Pakistan unbearable. Yet holding on to loyalty and a sense of duty, I appealed the decision, submitting new supporting letters. Months dragged by in anticipation, marked by extortion, police detentions, and worsening economic conditions, while the fate of my appeal lingered. My only solace amidst this turmoil is my 6-month-old child, for whom I endure, hoping for a future free from these trials. The stress has taken its toll, leaving me psychologically scarred, far from normalcy. In light of the administrative processes, the prolonged wait for an answer seems unjust. All that stands between me and resolution is the American Embassy in Islamabad. I implore those who hear my plea to lend their voice, to bridge the gap between my appeal and the authorities, to expedite this outcome. Before I lose myself in this abyss and my family faces an uncertain fate, I urge your cooperation. My only wish is for the swifter processing of my case, having appealed with utmost sincerity. Thank you for lending your ear. I'm so grateful to Sayi for sharing that story. I feel for anyone right now who's in Pakistan having to endure all of the uncertainty that's going on there with their deportations of illegal immigrants and possibly in the future even refugees who are there with documentation. So again, thank you for the story. And Gareth, thank you so much for talking about your work during those really important years that, we haven't really covered that period very much here at the podcast. So it was great to hear it from the perspective of someone who does come from, you come from a different country. You have seen things in a different way than any of our guests who are American have seen them. So it was really valuable and I really appreciate it.
Beth, thank you so much for having me on. And in preparation for this, I did listen to some of your other episodes, and absolutely intriguing, and a huge testament to those brave Afghans and folks from the US as well that have come out to speak, and just to footnote this whole thing. I don't think anybody comes on here seeking blame. We seek to learn. We need to learn. And inshallah, some good will come out of this. But for now, thank you so much. And your listeners and viewers, please do get in touch with me. I'm on LinkedIn. It's not hard to find me on there, so please do get in touch. And Beth, I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Inshallah, to echo you from earlier. And I do also look forward to that. And for all our listeners, thank you again for sharing your time and supporting the people of Afghanistan and all the people who have put so much of themselves into this effort. Tashakor, and we hope to see you again soon.
Tashakor.